Our guest today was born in Mexico City. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago and the London School of Economics. He was the editor of the Jerusalem Post, and now he is the foreign affairs columnist of the very great Wall Street Journal and deputy editor of the editorial page. Will you join with me as we welcome, please, Bret Stephens.
Well, George, thank you for the really lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be here, although I want to, since this seems to be more or less on the record, hasten to correct you on one point. I was raised in Mexico City, but I was born in New York City, and there's a birth certificate, long form, to demonstrate this. It's a pleasure to be in San Diego. It's a pleasure to be in this beautiful school. It's a pleasure to be here with Stand With Us and Audrey Jacobs, whom you know. Earlier today, I had an opportunity to go to the campus of UCSD down here and see what was called the apartheid wall being constructed by a Palestinian solidarity campaign. This wall, alongside some students who were blaring a rap song, which was probably the most hideously anti-Semitic rap song ever written, if that's possible. It's a kind of Der Stürmer put to rap music. And I'm reminded of the fact that Paul Johnson, the great British historian, once made the point that where Jews go and where they prosper, so other nations prosper. In Spain during the Islamic period, in Holland after the Inquisition, in the United States. And I just want to take note of the fact that when you find anti-Semitic songs blaring on campuses of great public universities, it ought to worry us a great deal about where we may be going here in the United States. So I applaud Stand With Us for raising that, for fighting that, for making people aware of just what's happening politically on campuses today. The topic of my speech is the future of capitalism, which is interesting to me, not only intrinsically, but interesting in the sense that I learned of this topic less than 24 hours ago. Small topic, you know, obviously one that is easily addressed in a short span of time. I'm reminded, though, of this wonderful exchange that Woodrow Wilson, apparently, this is, I don't know if this is folklore or true, but I'll treat it as true. Woodrow Wilson apparently had an exchange with some reporters in the Oval Office, and he said, gentlemen, if you want a 5-minute speech, give me a week. If you want a 30-minute speech, give me a few days. And if you want an hour's speech, I'm ready to go right now. So I propose to speak for about half an hour to 45 minutes and then maybe take a few questions. At any rate, when I learned what the topic was, I was reminded of a passage from a wonderful book that I'm reading, and which I enjoin you to read if you have endless amounts of time on your hands, no family connections, no job, or anything else, which is Winston Churchill's History of the First World War. It's people forget that Churchill wasn't only the greatest statesman of the 20th century, wasn't only one of the great soldiers, actually, of the late Victorian 19th century. He was also one of the world's great historians, and he wrote this account, somewhat self-serving account of the First World War. He was, of course, in the head of the Admiralty for the first couple of years of the war. But there was a passage of it which I thought was very powerful, so I jotted it down, and I wanted to read it to you because I think it's apposite to what I'd like to say this afternoon. And this is a short excerpt from his description of an episode in June 1914. This is just before the war begins, when the British fleet visited its German counterparts in the ports of Kiel and Kronstadt, two German port cities. And so this is June 1914. The Archduke Ferdinand is about to be assassinated. Charles Ferdinand is about to be assassinated. Mobilization will happen in August. That's when the Germans will invade France, and this cataclysm will begin. And Churchill writes, and I quote, "The finest ships of the British and German navies lay at their moorings side by side, surrounded by liners, yachts, and pleasure craft of every kind. There were races, there were banquets, there were speeches. There was sunshine. Officers and men fraternized and entertained each other afloat and ashore. Together they strolled arm in arm through the hospitable towns. The world, on the verge of its catastrophe, was very bright." Now, it's an extraordinary passage, very, very beautiful, very moving, but I think relevant to where we are today. We have been living in a period of relative global order for the past 67 years, since the end of the Second World War. That period, there's been a Cold War, there have been recessions, there have been genocides and so on, but that period has been generally pacific. It has been generally prosperous. Millions, in fact, billions of people have been brought out of poverty in Asia, in Asia especially, but also in Latin America, also here in the United States. It's been dominated by the fact of American supremacy, militarily, economically, politically. It has been generally trending towards more liberal, more open, more tolerant, more progressive societies. About 15 years ago, in fact, there was a political theorist who's now moved politically named Frank Fukuyama, who wrote a book called The End of History, basically saying that this liberal democratic model represented kind of a philosophical culmination of politics that would never be superseded. And there was this great debate whether after the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had perhaps reached a kind of end of history where all the great issues and questions would have to do with biotechnology or science, things other than politics and economics. And suddenly we find ourselves in 2012, possibly, I would even argue, probably in a pivot year that looks a lot like 1914. I'll say to the students here, since I'm glad you've turned out, you have to understand that in 1914, Europe had more or less been at peace for 99 years. For 99 years, you had had this continent, the center of global civilization, global power, global technology, global industry, and it had had a near century of peace. There had been wars, there had been colonialism, stuff had happened. But during that century of global order, dominated by the European powers and dominated especially by the British Navy, the world had progressed. And then suddenly, like this, the world moves into this period of global disorder. The First World War takes 20 million casualties. After the First World War, you have a period of sustained economic weakness, depressions in Europe, hyperinflation in Germany, the Great Depression here in the United States, and then that culminates in essentially what amounts to Chapter 2 of the Great European War, which is what we call the Second World War, and another 30-odd million people dying there. So there are periods of global order, and there are periods of global disorder, and the hinge between them can be very abrupt, very sudden. Now in 2012, we're looking at a number of what I think are pivotal events, which may also represent a kind of hinge year. And I want to just talk about what some of them may be. Here in the United States, there are two, maybe three great unknowns that we face in the next 6 months. The first unknown is whether next month the Supreme Court will or will not vote to rule that the President Obama's healthcare plan is unconstitutional or partially unconstitutional, or whether it's constitutional. And this is a question, this is a decision that's going to have major ramifications for a segment of the economy that is somewhere between 15 and 18% of the economy. It all hinges on the votes of 9 men and women. And we don't know how it's going to go, and we don't know how it's going to play out. Then in November, we're going to have a presidential election in which, as I said, or as President Obama has said, is going to be more consequential than most. And we really have no idea how that is going to go either. And then at the end of the year, there is going to be a lame duck session of Congress in which two great questions are going to be decided. And this is particularly, these matter a great deal to our military power and to our economic power. And that is whether the tax cuts of 2002, especially the cuts on capital gains, are going to be extended or extended for some period of time or not, and whether there is going to be a budget sequester. If there is a budget sequester, the Pentagon's budget will be cut by an additional $500 billion, cuts that Leon Panetta, the Secretary of Defense, a Democrat, has said will cripple America's ability to conduct a defense. So that's the picture, just a sort of capsule summary of what stands ahead of us in the next 6-7 months here in the United States. Now move over to Europe and look at what's happening there. For a long time, you've been hearing these reports that Europe maybe has turned a corner in the crisis of its currency and the crisis of its, well, let's begin with the crisis of its currency. They've had successive bailouts of Greece, of Portugal, of Ireland. 240 billion euros have been spent, or at least allocated, trying to save Greece. And Greece has effectively burned through that money in 20 months. Next year, Portugal comes back into the bond market, and there's no way that Portugal is going to be saved. If you're following the news from Spain, and I just met a lady who's here who's Spanish, how are you? I would be terrified, and you probably know better than I would be terrified to be a Spanish banker, certainly a Spanish bank regulator, today, noting the fact that their fourth largest bank is in the process of collapsing. All of this means that very soon Greece is going to be kicked out of, is going to leave, very likely to leave the Eurozone. It's very likely to leave the European Union as well. Soon that question will be in front of the Portuguese, it'll be in front of the Spanish, it'll be in front of the Italians. And you could see, and I don't think this is necessarily a good thing, because I think in many ways Europe has actually been well served by the euro, but you could see the unraveling of the euro as a currency area. What you might see next, what I would argue, the sort of chapter 2 of the euro crisis that we're entering, is a crisis of governance. And this is, look at what happened with the Greek elections, or the German elections just now in North Rhine-Westphalia, the French elections, and so on. One incumbent after another is losing. They're being kicked out of power, and radical parties are coming in. In Greece, you had a neo-Nazi party with a swastika-like emblem just get seats in the parliament. In France, Marine Le Pen, the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who is a kind of a fascist, basically, a neo-fascist, just took 16-17% of the vote. There's clearly a new constituency, or at least a much more assertive constituency for what amounts to fascist politics in Europe. There's a crisis of the old European political order, and it's not at all clear what is going to happen next.